Voilà, bah écoutez, je pense qu'on peut cette fois-ci officiellement ouvrir cette conférence. Encore une fois, merci à toutes celles et tous ceux qui sont avec nous ce soir, ici en présentiel dans les locaux de l'IRIS, l'Institut de Relations internationales et stratégiques, fondé par Pascal Boniface et dirigé par lui-même, qui ne peut pas, hélas, ce soir être parmi nous puisqu'il est en mission en Amérique du Sud, en Argentine, pays qui connaît bien les problématiques qui vont être traitées ce soir. Et donc, j'ai le plaisir d'ouvrir cette conférence. Donc, je m'appelle Christophe Ventura. Je suis directeur de...
My name is Christophe Ventura. I'm in charge of research at IRIS. I'm in charge of our Latin America Caribbean program. And I've had the pleasure of working with the organizations that Cécile Duflot will introduce in a few minutes, and also had the pleasure of working with our high-level panel members. Those are personalities who are known across the world and in their own countries for their high-level thinking. Cécile Duflot will tell you all about it in a minute. I simply want to thank you all for being here tonight. We at IRIS believe this is a fundamental debate on the connection between taxation in the broad sense of the word, inequalities, and also the need to protect or even safeguard democracies. This is a highly topical issue, as we all know. I'm not going to belabor this point, and it's even more important after the two global crises have hit all societies, whether north or south, east or west. Of course, I'm referring to the COVID-19 pandemic, closely followed by the war in Ukraine, the impacts of which, of course, compounding all of the trends that are producing inequalities, in particular, the erosion process that is affecting democracies. So ICRICT, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, as well as the EU Observatory on Taxation, as well as Oxfam France, are sending us their representatives to discuss the issue. Many thanks to Cécile Duflot for serving as a moderator tonight, and she will tell you what's up next. Thank you.
Voilà.
Merci beaucoup, ça marche là, vous m'entendez? Toujours pas? Si. J'espère que vous m'entendez à distance. So, good morning, good
afternoon, or rather good evening. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are, different time zones. Thank you all for being here with us. I'm the director of Oxfam France. My name is Cécile Duflot, and I will be moderating tonight's roundtable, jointly organized by ICRICT and the EU Tax Observatory, as well as Oxfam. At the international level, Oxfam is extremely involved in all those topics. Many thanks to IRIS, to his director, Pascal Boniface, and also the head of research, Christophe Ventura, for his kind word of introduction. IRIS is jointly organizing this event with us, as I said. So ICRICT is an organization, a group of leaders from across the world, people who firmly believe, and they share in our commitment. They firmly believe that there is an emergency. And there's also an unprecedented opportunity to include on the agenda a significant reform of international tax rules. You said this, we've said this, the issue of democracy goes hand in hand with international tax rules. And this is why we're very happy to have such high-level panel members for this discussion. We have here three members of ICRICT, Professor Jayati Ghosh, Joseph Stiglitz, as well as Gabriel Zucman. I would like to extend my warmest thanks to you all for your commitment, for your attendance tonight, and also for your contribution to this conversation, which is so necessary. This is a debate that we particularly need right here in France. There's a lot of social strife. There's a whole conversation going on at the national level, but this is also a social agenda that can be found across the world, whether in the US, throughout Africa, in India, across the globe, really. These are issues that matter to anyone who believes in justice and who's afraid of threats to justice and to democracy. And it is what the latest Oxfam International report was entitled The Law of the Richest, the Survival of the Richest. That's the title in English. So there is a significant risk that inequalities, which are higher than they've ever been, and they're getting worse and worse, inequalities that benefit the rich, and this could cause significant tensions and reduced standards of living in a lot of countries. This could mean a deterioration in the level of funding for public services and a worsening of inequalities when it comes to health, education, public transport, you name it. In all of those building blocks of what we call the social pact, the social covenant, and the balance of any democratic society. So throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, governments and central banks injected billions of euros in public funds to support the economies. And most of those billions benefited the richest, the 1%, major corporations. And some of those corporations actually want to return the favor. Now that the crisis has been overcome, they want to pay it forward. The government is currently driving 2 reforms intended to reduce public spending, both to support the unemployed and pensioners. And at this time, we need to be aware that that is a choice that may worsen inequalities via public policy. So this could worsen the democratic crisis that we are currently seeing. There's also a discussion on windfall profit. This is a conversation that we had amongst ourselves. We're continuing that discussion. This is true in Europe and in other EU member states. The issue of taxing windfall profits is not a taboo exactly, but this is not something that is being addressed by public policy. So we at Oxfam France use a figure, which is pretty striking. Even if we did accept that the deficit in the pension system came to 12 billion euro sometime soon, 2% of the wealth of the 42 French billionaires would be enough to cover that gap, that shortfall. So we are fully aware as an organization that there has been a wave of criticism, violent criticism, from those who are terribly afraid that this conversation may actually take place. Because, of course, this has drawn the attention of a lot of people beyond the usual circles, this issue of inequalities, this issue of France as a tax haven for billionaires, and that's a phrase that Gabriel Zucman coined. That very idea is insufferable, is unacceptable. So taxing the richest is an alternative to austerity policies, but it's not just an economic issue. First and foremost, it is a democratic issue. It's about preventing the fault lines that are dividing our societies. It's about public authorities saying no to the privatization of wealth, a privatization that would benefit a handful of lucky people. So I would now like to introduce to you our different speakers. Jayati Ghosh is a professor of economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the School of Social Science in Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. I apologize for mispronouncing all those names. Let us also welcome Joseph Stiglitz. He bears no introduction. He's a Nobel Prize winner, a professor at Columbia University, and a former senior vice president and chief economist at the World Bank. He's also a chief economist at the Roosevelt Institute. And lastly, Gabriel Zucman, the director of the EU Tax Observatory, as well as commissioner for ICRICT. Thank you to the three of you for being here tonight. My first question goes to you, Professor Stiglitz. Let me be blunt. Do you think that our democracies are in danger? And reforming our tax system, could that save those democracies? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. A real pleasure to be here. And the issue that you raise is really very much a focal point of a lot of the discussions in the United States and I think around the world. We feel particularly after the January 6th insurrection that our democracy in the United States was at risk. And then the fact that a vast majority of the Republican Party, which is one of the two parties, then decided that insurrection was just a peaceful demonstration, sort of like a party with a few policemen getting killed. But, let's not get overwrought about that. And, you talk to the people in Republicans, they say, that's the past, that's history. We have to go forward. But more broadly, when you do surveys both in the United States and around the world, there is a remarkable lack of support for democracy. That the value of democracy that we think of as so strong is not held that strongly by very large fractions of the people around the world. Now, it's bad enough that a majority of people today live in authoritarian regimes, and there has been a spread of authoritarianism. Poor Jayati here is experiencing some of that in India, which said it was the largest democracy in the world. But I think there's a good grounds for saying it no longer is. It's certainly on the way to being an authoritarian regime. And of course, we know China's become more authoritarian, let alone to speak about Russia. This battle has been the awareness that there is this differences in view has been heightened, I think, by the lack of support around the world for the position of the U.S. and Europe in the fight against Russia in Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine, there were a couple of votes at the UN which were very supportive. But then as time has gone on, that support has weakened significantly. So the question that all of this raises is why has there been this erosion of support for democracies around the world? And I think part of that it was a question I raised in my book, The Price of Inequality. And I argue there that the high levels of inequality that we were experiencing in the United States and that was being experienced in other countries around the world were dividing our society and undermining our democracy, giving rise to a view that the system was rigged in one way or another. And some of my own work, a lot of discussion about what were the sources of inequality. But I think there's now a broad consensus that at least a significant part of the inequality arises from the rules of the game, the failure to enforce in the United States antitrust laws. So you have a few people able to make enormous amounts of money out of monopoly profits. And it's just so visible that they're making monopoly profits. The standard theory in market economy is you're making huge profits. People are supposed to enter, and those profits get eroded away. And it's not supposed to take 50 years. It's supposed to happen relatively quickly, and it's not happening. And so that's just one example. We're having a fight right now in the United States over changes in the antitrust law. Very hard to do that. And you can go through each of the rules of the economy, labor laws, including pension laws, but how people bargain, labor rights, globalization, the rules of globalization. All of these have played a role in shaping the inequality, and the rules have been disproportionately shaped by the people at the top, and particularly in American democracy, where we have a framework which allows for money to have a lot of influence in the political process. You sort of have a vicious circle where you have economic inequality leading to more political inequality, leading to rules that reinforce the economic inequality. And while the United States, I think, is the worst example, this is going on in lesser degrees in countries around the world. So the question then is what to do about it, and that's where there are many aspects of this, and particularly many aspects of understanding why there's so little support for democracy in the global South, and so little support for the West in the war in Ukraine. But part of it is our selfishness in sharing the intellectual property associated with COVID-19, the vaccines, the vaccine apartheid. Part of it has to do with the problems associated with the debt and how we're handling it. But part of it has to do with money, and that's where the tax comes in. In most advanced countries, the people that we've talked for a long time about progressive tax systems. That is, the people at the top should pay a higher percentage of their income than people down below. The fact is that tax systems in the United States and many other advanced countries and many in developing countries are not progressive. Warren Buffett, who's one of our wealthiest people, actually put it very forcefully. He said, there's something wrong with the system where he pays a lower tax rate than a secretary. And when he said that, he was not even thinking about the fact that he was not paying taxes on his unrealized capital gains. He was only talking about the tax rate, including his realized capital gains. But if he had included his unrealized capital gains, he would have realized that he was actually paying even a very, very low tax rate. So, the system the tax system we have means that we're not raising the revenues that we need to address societal problems, including the problems associated with inequality, but also with investments, education, research. So, it also contributes to this system, to the perception, accurate perception, that the system is in a fundamental way unfair. Now, we've at ICRICT began our focus, as the name suggests. It's a terrible acronym. I think we've all disliked the acronym, but once you get an acronym, you can't get rid of it. Have focused on, began our attention focusing on corporate multinational taxation of multinational corporate that discussion has started before the BEPS process. I don't know which is the OECD process of concern with base erosion, like just and profit shifting. And base erosion and profit shifting just says that the multinationals have used globalization in a very effective way to shift their income and sometimes their economic activity, but more often just how they record their income in such a way that more of the income is recorded in low tax jurisdictions. So they're very good at paying very low taxes. So, Apple is an example. These companies make products that are good. The recent example of their generative AI was not quite so good, but in general they've been innovative. But they've even been more innovative in avoiding taxes, and there's a distinction between tax evasion and tax avoidance. Tax evasion is where you break the law, and tax avoidance is where you avoid paying taxes by taking advantage of every provision in the tax law and using a legion of lobbyists to change the tax law so you don't have to pay taxes. And one of the things that we highlight in American business schools is how to make sure that you avoid taxes without going to jail. That is one. So if you get an MBA, that's one of the things that we succeed in teaching. The other thing, actually, a very interesting paper had just come out by a group of economists headed by with Oxfam at MIT, showing that the main, when a company, economists like to do studies where you can identify the effects by like a controlled experiment or a natural experiment. And what they showed that the effect of having an MBA from an American university does increase profits, but the way it does it, it doesn't increase productivity. It doesn't do anything except teach our CEOs how to lower wages and weaken worker protections. So it's all about shifting the share of labor down and increasing the profits to be distributed. Really quite an interesting study that many of you may want to take a look at. But the point is that if corporate profits go up, you ought to at least be able to try to tax them to help people in their retirement or whatever their needs. But the fact is that the companies like Apple have been really good in figuring out how to use globalization to avoid paying taxes. So that was where we began our work. And a little after we began our work, the OECD took up a similar work. And then just a couple of years ago, they came to the end of their work with a proposal that had two parts to it. We won't go through the details, but one part was a terrible part where called Pillar 1, where they allocating global tax rights. And one of the things that we were talking about is a paper was presented today in our meeting was how much extra income would all the developing countries together get as a result of this major reform that's been going on. It took enormous amount of negotiation, an enormous effort of a lot of countries after many, many years, and everybody celebrating this wonderful achievement. In the first part of the proposal, half of the proposal, the grand total for all the developing countries together was $36 million for LDCs. Really quite striking failure. I think, but they still are. And by the way, they did not want to. They did not distribute a discussion publicly of what the numbers were before they asked the countries to sign up to this agreement, which again is quite striking. Now it was a result of Gabriel's. I mean, not the numbers came from Gabriel's EU Observatory. The second part of the pillar is something really important, which is a global minimum tax. The principle is very important, so you don't have a race to the bottom. The number was too low, 15%. Below the number that's already there. So we're worried that it will actually, at the end, lead to a lower tax rates rather than higher tax rates. But the third part is that we've begun to focus more on is a global, to have countries pass a wealth tax. And the good news is that the crises that we've been going through has highlighted this wealth inequality, including the Oxfam report that came out at Davos, and that if you're going to raise the requisite revenues, you're going to have to use. First of all, you're going to have to follow the money, and the money is all at the top, and you have to going to use all the tools that you can get, and a tax on wealth is an important part of that. So let me just wind up and just say, yes, we have a problem. We should be worried about the preservation of democracies, that there are many factors at play, but certainly inequality is one of them. And one of the very important tools to address that is more progressive taxation. And two of the ways of dealing with that is to limit the extent of global tax avoidance and evasion. And the other one is the imposition of wealth taxes.
Merci. Thank you, Professor. Let me move to, sorry, in French. Je vous passe la...
Now, Jayati Ghosh. Let's open things up a little bit. Professor Stiglitz has started to do that, but what about developing countries? Let's open up the conversation. On several occasions, you did alert to the fact that there's been one crisis after another, and the developing countries have been hard hit by those successive crises. They have a high level of debt, and tax receipts are going down. So austerity is back on the agenda in those countries after things had started to go a little better, and there's been a massive loss of investment in terms of public services. So would you echo what Professor Stiglitz has been saying regarding this erosion phenomenon? And what about prospects, and how can we improve those prospects in those countries? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and be able to discuss, I think, what are really some of the most important issues of our time with these amazing people. I agree with everything Joe said, but I mean, it's not a competition in tragedy, but honestly, I think it's much, much worse in the developing world. So seriously, you know, we already during COVID, we didn't have the big fiscal expansion you all got. We didn't even have the big monetary expansion we all got. We did less. Developing countries as a group did less than they had done after the global financial crisis. The low-income countries as a group, guess how much additional money they spent per capita in the period between January 2020 and March 2021? $2 per capita additional spending. So, I mean, we are talking about countries that were already ravaged by a pandemic, didn't get vaccines on time because we all know why, didn't actually manage to control the disease, had lockdowns that destroyed livelihoods, and then didn't have social protection. They couldn't afford social protection. About 80 developing countries were spending more on debt servicing than on public health, all through the pandemic. So we are talking about countries that were already massively ravaged. Then you have the Ukraine war. I don't even, the big increases in food and fuel prices were not really the result of the war. They were the result of the fact that the war enabled massive profiteering and financial speculation in commodity markets, which was unchecked. And this in turn meant massive increases in global prices, which then are now back to pre-war levels, except that for developing countries, we're still paying more. Because meanwhile, our currencies depreciated. Not only were we affected because we couldn't export as much, we had to pay more for our imports, but then there's capital flight. And of course, the minute you're beginning to get slightly back up from your knees from all of that tragedy, then the US says, oh, it's time for monetary tightening. And we're sorry it's going to hurt all of you, but honestly, we have to look at our own inflation. Now, Joe has written very extensively about how that is a terrible recipe to deal with inflation, even in your own country. But just think what it is doing to the rest of the world. Suddenly, countries that were proceeding somehow to pick up the pieces and try and recover and so on, are then hit with this massive impact of higher interest rates, which means capital leaves their countries. And countries that were on a reasonable debt trajectory suddenly find, oh my God, there's no money to pay our debt. Suddenly our bond values are collapsing. Suddenly we have no access to international funds. And so even if you didn't have a crisis before, you suddenly have now even an external crisis. The IMF, every time I look at the number that they say of countries in deep debt stress, the number is up. So it was 58, then 62, now I think it's 72 countries in serious debt stress. And these are, what does serious debt stress mean? It means that very likely you would default within a few months. Now, what does that mean? It means that there are countries that are having to cut down on essential imports, that are having to deal with, having to impose all kinds of terrible suffering on their people. None of this is necessary. Now, it's true that a lot of it was damage inflicted by things going on in the advanced economies, which then have filtered out to the rest of us. But it also is because these are countries that are unable to raise revenues. So all of the things that Joe mentioned, that, we are not able to provide basic services, we're not able to do social protection, we're not able to even kickstart our economies through the kind of public spending, public investment. We can't deal with climate challenges, we can't address poverty, we can't address inadequate nutrition because we don't have the revenues. Some of it, I agree, it's self-inflicted. My own country, I'm always stunned when I read all these international reports. India is the bright spot in the global economy. And really? Why is it a bright spot? Because we have the highest rate of growth. Why? Because we have the biggest collapse. Okay, no surprise. We're just about back to where we were pre-pandemic levels, but hey, it's a high rate of growth. So because of that high rate of growth, suddenly everyone says, yeah, we should look at India. It's doing so well. Why is it doing so well? Because 94% of the additional GDP increase is estimated to have gone to the top 10% of the population. We have got real wages which are stagnant compared to the pre-COVID period. They collapsed and they've just about barely made it. Women's wages fallen in that period. Employment levels are lower than they were in 2017-18. Absolute, this people in paid employment, it's lower than it was 5 years ago. So we're talking about an economy that, to me at least, seems like it's in deep distress. There's clearly an increase in poverty. We don't know how much because the government won't do any surveys to capture that increase in poverty. We know that there's a big increase in profitability. But again, 90% of those profits are in the top 100 companies. More than half, in fact, 60% is in the top 10 companies. So it's a really K-shaped. In other words, the upper end of the K has gone off the charts. It's completely K-shaped. That's the state in India. What happens as a result? Of course, there's unrest. Of course, there's unhappiness. It then gets modified into a general anger and resentment. In my own country, tragically, it's been able to be converted into violence against the other. I think you're not unfamiliar with that, right? Anger with migrants in your case, anger with Muslims in India's case. You find another in which to divert the population, and you impose authoritarian sort of tendencies towards any dissent, anyone trying to identify the real cause of the problem. So yes, it's a death of democracy from above. There are other countries. Let me focus just on my own region, and because Sri Lanka. had an amazing, wonderful, peaceful protest, a mass protest, the Aragalaya, as they call it, which succeeded in getting rid of a corrupt ruling family. But they got the same people back again. The ruling elite, not the same family, but everybody else is still running the country. And the Sri Lankan people are now experiencing the worst kind of austerity. They had a protest because of the impact of collapse of social services, high price of petrol, and so on. Guess what happened since then? The price of fuel has gone up by 68% since then. The price of food has gone up by 40%. Money wages have fallen. Employment has fallen. So we are talking about a middle-income country, which is now on the verge of becoming a low-income country. And again, with the elites doing just fine, thank you, with the poor people being affected. This is after an amazing, peaceful, non-violent upsurge, mass mobilized. So what are people going to think? Does a peaceful protest help? They will start thinking maybe another kind of protest helps. And you get a different kind of response. Pakistan had a major flood, which destroyed something like 22% of the GDP and major physical assets. It's a climate-related event, everybody knows. Did they get the kind of compensation that was promised to all the developing countries? No. Instead, what have they got to do? They are now forced to go with a begging bowl to the IMF, saying, you know, we've run out of money. We have 1 month of imports left of reserves. We can't do anything. Please, we'll do whatever you want to give us this tiny little bit of money that the IMF will give. The IMF has asked them, well, you know, you're giving free electricity to people who are consuming more than 300 watts per month. Very, very poor people, right? No, you can't give free electricity. That's, you know, so you have to charge them for electricity. This is in a country which has experienced major floods where, again, inflation is at 60%, where farmers are unable to even get a net positive income. And you're saying, no, you have to pay electricity charges. No, you can't have a tax on luxury imports because that's against free trade. You have to get rid of all the taxes on luxury imports. So in other words, there is a tendency now towards imposing different kinds of economic and political authoritarianism that essentially serve the interests of large capital within the country and global capital. And none of this is necessary. A large part of this happens, I will finally just say, because, you know, across the world, in the rich countries, in the developing countries, everywhere, across the world, we somehow think that these issues about whether you can tax or not are too complex, too technocratic, something we don't understand. And of course, every time people say, well, why can't we tax the rich? Or why can't we tax corporations? Or why can't we make sure corporations, multinationals pay the same tax rate as domestic companies? You will get a huge barrage of very complicated technical reasons about why this can't be done. The OECD process that Joe was describing was supposedly to deal with these very obvious possibilities for tax avoidance, and it can be done. It's low-hanging fruit. What actually happened over 7 years of this complicated process is that they managed to make it so complex and so watered down that it's delivering nothing. And so people will say, well, what's the point of even trying to get taxes? Because, you know, after 7 years of trying, all we're getting is this tiny amount. It doesn't change anything. We are letting this happen. It is very important for people, for public everywhere, society everywhere, to actually know about these processes and call the bluff of our governments and our elites when they tell us there is no money and we don't have the money to provide your basic social and economic rights. And that's true for all of us everywhere, but it's particularly true for all of you because I swear to you, it matters what you do in the rich world. It really still matters what you do because it allows all of us to also do something. Thanks.
I am still waiting for the reason to hope, but I need. Gabriel may try. Gabriel, on a donc parlé du rôle des paradis fiscaux, de.
Gabriel, we talked about tax havens, concentration of wealth, the fact that major corporations get their hands on brilliant MBA students who find ways of avoiding paying taxes. Is it globalization? Is globalization the reason behind the ramp up inequalities? Is that a threat to democracies? I'm going to try and find that reason to hope. Can we maybe unravel this deliberately complex apparatus that Jayati just talked about? Globalization as we know it, with the race to the bottom, with a tax forum shopping, an explosion of profit, registered in tax havens, increased financial opacity. Yes, of course, that kind of globalization did help to worsen inequalities, but there's something that is really important to understand. That type of globalization is just one among many. There are many different potential types of globalization. Choices have been made since the 1980s. Those choices may not have been discussed transparently or democratically. You need to understand that many other choices could be made. There are multiple ways of organizing globalization. So these are the two aspects that you need to understand. First of all, what have we done since the 1980s in terms of organizing globalization that may have helped to worsen inequalities? It's pretty simple. Governments across the world have stopped taxing the main winners of globalization. If you look at the changes in tax rate, if you look at the average tax rate, the nominal tax rate on corporations was 50%. Now it's down to 20 or 25%. Okay, keep it up for the next 40 years. We'll get to 0%. Eventually, corporations will pay 0%. If we look at offshoring profit to tax havens, nearly 40% of multinational profit registered by corporations outside the country where they are headquartered, well, they're registered in tax havens, and the effective tax rate is about 5%, so very low. So we're talking $1 trillion dollars or euros every year are registered in tax havens by Apple in Ireland and other low tax countries. If we look at what's happening in terms of taxing individuals, a lot of countries, including France, used to have a wealth tax. Most of those countries have abolished that wealth tax. A lot of countries have replaced progressive capital taxes or dividend taxes by flat taxes on return on capital. So there's a single flat tax, irrespective of how much you're making. And typically, this is a lower tax rate than for labor or income from labor. So multinational corporations and their shareholders are the main winners from globalization. So we're talking high net worth individuals. So instead of making or rather paying more taxes as they benefited more from globalization, that was a promise in the 1980s, right? How do you negotiate those free trade agreements, etc.? Economists and political decision makers at the time said this will help increase inequalities, yes, but you can also tax the main winners from globalization so that eventually everybody will benefit. What actually happened was the exact opposite. So instead of taxing more the main winners, they started paying less taxes. So it's easy to understand that this is a dynamic that's at play, because the more money you make, the less taxes you pay. By definition, somebody has to pay those taxes, right? And it is the middle class and the poorest of the poor that end up paying those taxes. Or this could mean fewer public services and fewer public transfers. We understand that this system is not sustainable, whether economically or politically. So the good news, and that's the main part, because you want a reason to hope, right? There are ways to do things differently. And this is an idea that is deeply rooted. A lot of people sincerely believe that tax competition, tax evasion, tax optimization, tax planning are natural laws. There's nothing you can do about it. A lot of people sincerely think that in a globalized world, there's always going to be lower tax countries. And so it is in your interest to report your pay taxes or report your profit in those lower tax countries. It's a natural law. There's nothing you can do about it. No matter how sincere you are in that belief, pardon my French, this is bullshit. as individuals, as nations, as countries, you can involve yourself in tax cooperation. You can choose to tax profit of multinationals in tax havens the same way that up until now we decided not to tax them. Instead of not taxing, we can decide to tax corporations or high net worth individuals. So in concrete terms, what can we do? I would like to emphasize the fact that in actual fact, if we take a step back, if we look at what's been happening over the past 10 years, the seeds of real progress can be found. They can be observed. Steps have been taken in the right direction on two fronts. Number one, international cooperation, the sharing of information. 15 or 10 years ago, there was 100% banking secrecy. If you're a high net worth individual, it's easy to hide your money in tax havens. Now there's an automated exchange of information between banks since 2017, 2018. So in principle, bankers, whether in the Cayman Islands or Switzerland, have an obligation to report the identity of their customers, the extent of their assets, etc., to the French tax office. I would be naive if I thought that all those bankers who for decades spent time hiding their customers' money, sometimes carrying diamonds in toothpaste tubes, or sending bank statements hidden in the sports page of the Financial Times. Okay? I don't want to be naive and say that that's completely gone, but we have made progress. We have a system for the automated sharing of information. It's real progress. Secondly, and that's something that we can rely upon to better tax high net worth individuals or high incomes. That's the point, right? Using that information to better tax high net worth individuals and corporations. So the second major advance that will materialize as early as next year, a minimum tax on multinational corporations, a 15% minimum tax on the profit generated by multinational corporations. So 15% is not enough, okay? In France, we're talking 50%. Except for billionaires, the effective tax rate is about 50%, unless you're a millionaire. So the most powerful economic stakeholders, and I'm referring to multinational corporations, they're okay paying 15%, but to us, it's unacceptable. It's absurd. But 15% is still better than 0%, right? It's better than what we've done or achieved so far. So it's a step in the right direction. Also, we now have a foundation, a basis upon which we can rely. Now that we have a minimum effective tax rate, there's nothing stopping us from hiking that up. 2 years ago, the US administration wanted a minimum income tax rate of 21%. Since then, they have scaled back their ambitions and brought that down to 15%. But from next year, any country, including France, or jointly together with Spain or Germany, you can have a coalition of countries that could decide on a minimum tax rate of 21%, 25%, or even 30%. So what am I saying? Like I said, baby steps in the right direction. Doesn't look like much right now. It's still unsatisfactory, but it gives me hope that 15, 20, 30 years from now, we can better reform globalization and make sure that the winners pay more tax. Thank you, Gabriel. More baby steps, or even bigger steps in the right direction if we dare. Joe, what do you think of the latest developments in the US? After Joe Biden made an announcement, he's contemplating a 25% minimum tax on billionaires and to increase taxes on high net worth individuals. So there are discussions regarding that minimum tax rate, 21%. We're not really sure what the actual US position is at the moment, but we do feel that when you bring them all together, all of those initiatives are changing the discourse around the issue of taxation. And this could mean a return to a progressive taxation system. So do you think that this will actually happen? And also, why do you say to those who claim that those measures of vote-catching efforts are populist measures. And this is my last question. Do you think that this will help change the debate, change the conversation in other places besides the US?
I wish there were a good chance that it would get through in the current political climate in the United States, where the Republicans control one house of Congress. But I think the probability of that is zero. It's not going to happen. I think I can say that with a fair degree of confidence. But I do think that his proposals, there was another proposal to increase the minimum tax from 15 to 21%, which is getting closer to the 25% that we've been advocating. I think these proposals are very important. I do think they reflect a view of a majority of Americans. There are surveys that a majority of Americans believe that there should be a wealth tax. They believe that there should be more progressive taxes. And this relates very much to the point that I made in my earlier remarks, that there is a disconnect between politics today and where a lot of people sentiment is. You're experiencing that in France right now, where there's a very large fraction of the population taking a particular view on the pension so-called reform, and yet the government is continuing to push it through. In the United States, if you look at most of the agenda of the progressive part of the Democratic Party, it actually, it's not very revolutionary. It's the idea that everybody should have access to health care is not exactly a radical idea. Most of the advanced countries have recognized that. You can say it was back in the Declaration of Human Rights of the UN, the universal access to health care. So, and I think a vast majority of Americans believe that is the right way to go. And I think it would actually increase productivity. Life expectancy in the United States has been in decline. There are groups like Native Americans where the life expectancy is lower than in any country in the Western Hemisphere than Haiti. So it's comparable to a really LDC. So this more, and having this will require higher taxes and more progressive taxes. One thing that came up a little earlier has been mentioned. We've been going through a very difficult time with the pandemic, the war, the inflation, the increase in oil prices, and so forth. And as that has been going on, there are a few companies making enormous profits. The oil companies, for instance. And you have to ask, did the oil companies do anything to deserve these profits? It was only because they're sitting on an asset, and they really are. This is one of the few cases where you can say windfall profits. And CEOs of these oil companies are now getting huge increase bonuses. You ask, bonus for what did they do to deserve that bonus? Incentive systems you can understand. Economists always talk about incentives, but this is nothing. The increased profits is not because they worked harder. They may have, not spent every day on the golf course, but this increase in profits is not because they went off the golf course. It was because the price of oil went up. And so the notion that we ought to have a windfall profits tax seems a no-brainer. And the nature of the politics in the United States is that even when the Democrats controlled Congress officially, we could not, the Biden administration did not believe that it could propose a windfall profits tax and get it through. So to go back, I think that it is important that we begin these kinds of discussions about more progressive tax reforms. I think by discussing these issues more, I think we open the scope for what can be done. The notion, for instance, of a windfall of a wealth tax. Jose Antonio Campo, who's one of our was the chair of our commission, became the finance minister in Colombia, and he succeeded in actually getting that done. So I think there are benefits of opening up the discussion, and what Gabriel said is all of these are matters of choices. And the final comment I want to make is maybe to dash a little. You talk about a little hope. On the other side, well, looking at both sides, in the year right after the pandemic, the bill that was passed to help us get through the pandemic included provisions that had the effect of reducing the childhood poverty rate by 40 to 50% in 1 year. And you talk about inequality being a choice. Here, we were in the worst possible circumstances, but we were able to actually reduce childhood poverty in 1 year by 50%. But now the Republicans want to get our poverty rate back up. It's not a joke. The provisions that were in that bill, they refused to support, including some Democrats like Manchin, they refused to support those provisions. So we in the United States will be seeing our childhood poverty rate going back to the high levels that it had before the pandemic. So, it just reminds us that this public discourse is really important. It is possible to change things for the better, but if we don't continue fighting, things could get a lot worse.
Just to go further 1 minute, you say you are not very optimistic about the result, but do you really think a wealth tax could be a solution in the US at the beginning?
Well, I don't think there's going to be any magic bullet. I think that the reason for having a wealth tax in part is that we've never succeeded in taxing capital income in the way that we should. We don't tax inheritance. If we had good inheritance taxes, good capital gains taxes, good income taxes, the argument would be somewhat different. But we don't have those taxes. And so anybody involved in, who's aware of thinking about overall tax structure says we have to use every instrument that we have possible. And the wealth tax is an important instrument. I think it can be implemented We've been discussing various problems of implementation. I think I'm quite convinced it can be implemented. What Colombia is doing, Argentina, one of the members of the commission was a former Minister of Economy for Argentina, Martin Guzman. They raise about 0.7% of GDP. The databases are probably, in principle, not as good as our databases are. We should be able to get better data than they have. So if you ask, could we implement it? Yes, I think, all the loopholes that we talk about are loopholes that could be closed. We have to remember that the tax havens exist because we want them to exist. If we said that we have to report in the United States income in principle that we have wherever it's generated every year. And we have to report whether we have bank accounts wherever they are in the world. And not doing that is a federal offense. And you can force corporations to report the income, their activity, the wealth they have in the tax havens. And if they don't do it, they can be prosecuted. And if you did that and you tax them on that, as if that income were earned abroad, were earned at home, that kind of tax avoidance could be eliminated. So the use of these tax havens as tax havens is a decision of the advanced countries. And India, and I mean, I don't want to say we're alone in engaging in this, but at least for those in each of our countries, we can, I believe, particularly with modern technology and these new agreements about exchange of information, we can shut them down. And therefore, I think we can implement a wealth tax.
Thank you. Thank you. Jayati, je voudrais qu'on revienne sur...
Jayati, back to you. I'd like to come back to the role of institutions, international institutions with you. You gave the example of Pakistan earlier and IMF. If we take this a step further, could we consider that with all the bad examples, would you say that multilateralism, in a sense, is not an answer to developing countries, and could even worsen the situation? I want to be optimistic this evening, as you may have noticed. Do you think we could shift this trend, turn things around? And do you think that the G20 this year in India and next year in Brazil, do you think that if we give a stronger voice to the South and also to civil society, do you think we could change the agenda? Gabriel said that there has been progress. He said that we could hope for greater progress. How do you see things going forward? And how do you see multilateralism, which has been a hurdle, which has slowed down things in several developing countries?
Cécile, I have to definitely try and be optimistic now and positive.
Yes, thank you.
And not depress you further about all of this.
But realistic too, okay.
But yeah, so yes, I think there is potential. And I think, Joe is absolutely right. So for example, windfall profit taxes, as he said, I think he called it a no-brainer. It is so obvious. And there are more and more countries that are beginning to recognize this. And in fact, some countries are beginning to impose this on the profits that were made over the last year, which were obscene, as we know. I mean, I think it's not just oil companies that are candidates, but agribusinesses, in fact, that really profited massively over the last year. Pharma companies that benefited from monopolies that resulted from technologies 90% developed by public support. So I think there are many candidates for windfall profit taxes, and many countries can do it if there is sufficient public pressure. So I come back to that point. There has to be enough noise from people to make governments want to do this. I also want to mention the wealth tax. You know, an economist had estimated in India in 2020, no, sorry, before the pandemic, 2019, that if you tax just the top 965 families, these were the Indian billionaires. So very, very high incomes in India. 965 families, you tax 4% of their wealth. That's 1% of GDP. Now, 1% of GDP is double the total public health expenditure of India. I mean, I know, okay, it's crazy low, obscene, right? But still, it would be double the current public health expenditure. So imagine, and 4%, they wouldn't even notice if you took 4%. I mean, that's the kind of thing they would, you know, sort of not notice at all that it had been taxed. So there's really low-hanging fruit out there. And I also agree that now more and more countries are showing us that it can be done. I mean, Jose Antonio and Ocampo in Colombia, in a relatively short time, has managed to change the discourse and bring in all kinds of new taxes and new possibilities, which are the kinds of things that we've been talking about. There are, Malaysia is considering now a wealth tax and a tax on incomes and assets held abroad. So there are other countries that are thinking of these things, and it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it would always require an international cooperation to do so. That's important because, as you mentioned, multilateralism right now is not working. Okay, in fact, it's broken. Let's admit it. It's a broken system, and it clearly needs drastic reform, not just because it's not meeting the central challenges of our time, but also because people have lost faith in it. Yeah, people across the world, wherever you go, nobody really thinks of a multilateral solution. And when they do try an attempt, like the OECD supposedly inclusive process, often the outcome tends to be something that is so minor relative to the promise that it doesn't deliver. Does that mean we can abandon multilateralism? Absolutely not. Because unfortunately, our challenges are global, right? We can't pretend they're not. I mean, pandemics are global. They don't look at visas and passports and so on. Climate change, again, it's global. And so we can't say that, well, you know, we are going to look at only our national concerns or maybe our small regional concerns, because the challenges require public investment at a global level. The challenges require cooperation. And I do believe that if there is sufficient, I keep repeating this, sorry, but if there is sufficient social pressure, our governments will be forced to respond. Even the most authoritarian governments, believe me, I know, even the most authoritarian governments require legitimacy. And ultimately, there's only so much legitimacy you can get by fooling people and getting them to hate one another and so on. You do have to actually deliver. If we can make these into really major public demands that cannot be ignored, then I do think we could actually generate even a recovery of multilateralism, of the positive kind, of the kind that frankly humanity needs, because we do have global challenges. And so I'm not pessimistic completely, because it's really, okay, it boils down to a question of whether you think humanity will step back from the brink. Because I think we all recognize we are on a kind of brink, right? Planetary, climate challenges, etc. If we do believe humanity can step back from the brink, and I do, because otherwise we wouldn't all be here at all, right? Then it's our job to make sure humanity gets motivated enough to make sure we step back from the brink. In other words, I do believe governments can be forced by their people, even when they're pretty awful authoritarian governments. So I think it's part of our job is to actually go out there and make people sufficiently impassioned about it to force their governments to change.
Can I just add one note of little optimism on multilateralism, qualified optimism? And that is, or two notes. One is that at the top, at the IMF, they've talked a lot more about a concern about inequality, about poverty, about climate change. And they've taken a much more open, a very changed attitude towards debt renegotiation, debt restructuring, that is sufficiently changed that it has irritated Wall Street enough to make them want to get change they had of the IMF. So that is at least an indicator that they actually were doing something right, that they got Wall Street very unhappy. It doesn't always trickle down all the way to the staff working in Pakistan, but it's better than the alternative. The second little piece of you might say optimism is that the head of the World Bank, Malpass, who has for 4 years tried to pretend, been a climate denier and been running the most important global institution for supporting climate investment, has resigned and is leaving as of June. And the person that has been nominated by President Biden is one who is much more concerned about the issues of climate change, poverty. And so at least there's a moment of hope now that going forward that the World Bank will play the role that it could play in multilateralism in a more positive way.
Okay. So I hope we can continue with optimism because we are going back to France with Gabriel. I'm not sure.
It would have been difficult this evening to not talk about the burning headlines, the burning recent events in France. Of course, referring to the pension reform. There is another massive demonstration scheduled tomorrow. Trade unions have seldomly been so united. And yet the government without a majority is pushing through. Gabriel, you are of those who claim that alternatives exist. So to continue the question of taxation of the very rich, you've worked on tax havens for the very rich, claiming that France is one. Some have really taken this subject, and there seems to be some denial in the public opinion. This debate is little by little making progress. So could you tell us how if you believe in a different tax model, even though the French say France is the country where we have the most distributive system and where taxes are already the highest. Well, I think to understand the pension question, we have to rewind a little bit. In 2019, a structural reform of pension systems was suggested, inspired mainly by what is done in Scandinavian countries, which to a certain extent are interesting. And the authorities started to consider a very profound change of the retirement system. Then we were hit by COVID-19, and now they're coming up with this very new reform. This is not about modernizing the retirement system. This is a way to address the deteriorated public finance system. We've lost a number of points of GDP, and the government is seeing what they can do to generate money. So they're introducing this reform. They want 15, 20 billion euros, roughly 1 point of GDP. This is pure accounting. This is not about modernizing or structurally changing the system. So it's pure accounting. It's about reducing COVID-19 deficits. It's about generating more money through taxes. So what they did is they looked at what contributions people pay. France is not a tax haven, okay? This is not a surprise. Taxes are very high in France. Pretty much half of all income is paid in taxes and then redistributed. When you take all taxes combined. So when we look at who pays what, you realize that approximately all classes, income classes, pay more or less 50%. Taxes, VAT, social contributions, income taxes, real estate taxes, property taxes, you name it. One exception, however, the very rich. Billionaires, high net worth individuals who hold massive assets. A recent study shows that their effective tax rate, all taxes combined, VAT, corporate tax, income tax, and so on, is anywhere between 20 and 25%. That's half of what all the other people pay, okay? So where does that number come from? 20 to 25% for very high net worth individuals. Well, very wealthy people, when you look at their effective income taxes, their income tax is between 2 and 3% for the 370 richest families. Okay? This is the pillar of fiscal progressivity. We have failed there precisely to tax wealthy people. An even more recent version of the study shows that this tax is actually getting closer to 0%, 0.5% for the 37 richest people in France. So in practice, the wealthier you are, the less you pay. The mechanisms are very clear. They use holding companies. Those fortunes are, these people are shareholders of large companies that make a lot of money. They receive huge dividends, but these dividends go to holding companies, and they're saved, they're reinvested, and thereby they don't pay taxes. So this is a considerable political failure for France. And the effective rate is 2 times lower than for all other income groups, quite simply. So the bottom line of this is, what does this mean? It means that rich families in France, the only tax they pay is corporate tax. The corporate tax is paid through the companies they own. So they pay little VAT, they pay very little income tax, no social contributions. The only real tax they pay is corporate tax, which is, the total is between 20 and 25%. So in conclusion, and again, the numbers don't lie, France is a tax haven for the very rich, because the very rich only pay corporate taxes. The corporate taxes were diminished 33%, from 33 to 25% between 2017 and 2022. And it may be further reduced in the years to come. Who knows? Maybe we'll go down to 15%. This is not to be excluded. So this is where we stand. So the most logical way to collect more money would be to turn to the very wealthy people who pay less, who pay a lot less than the rest of the population. Before COVID-19, I did the math to calculate what would be the numbers and how much it would generate if we did the same thing, if we did the same thing as what Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders suggested during the campaign in the US. If we did the same thing, you know, we're talking about very high net worth individuals, 30 million and more, and the rates would, of course, increase. The more you earn, the more you pay. But if we had a similar taxation system, it would only apply to a very few taxpayers, very rich taxpayers. We would be able to collect an additional 20 to 25 billion euros. That's one point of digit. That's before COVID-19. They became a lot richer since. It could be 30 billion. That's 2 times more than what is expected to come from the retirement reforms. So we have a budget problem. Our budget is out of balance. We need to address the public deficit issue. The answer is, how do we do it in a democratic way? Well, we could ask people to work for longer, and which is what the authorities are currently doing. It's going to impact people who, generally low-income people who started to work early, or we could ask the very wealthy to pay a little more.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for 1, possibly 2 questions, maximum 3. Maximum 3. I think we're going to take 1 question. So let's take the questions, and then we can decide who answers what.
Bonsoir. OK, merci beaucoup.
Good evening. Thank you, first of all, for organizing this evening's event. I spent quite a bit of time in my life at the UN, and during the General Assembly in 2018, sorry. Sorry, I couldn't grasp the name, but someone talked about Ecuador. People who wanted to have a public position in Ecuador had to prove they did not own any assets in tax havens. So I've sort of been following up on this and tracking this. The question is, how are we going to pay for sustainable development objectives? If there is anyone in the room here, or are there any other success stories besides Ecuador? I recently lived in Tunisia, and Tunisia, there is the World Bank.
During now, because there's been a couple of weeks ago, the president made some very unsavory comments, which made more of an issue with violence in the country. And so the FME and the World Bank programs are paused. And so I'm wondering if you have anything to say about Tunisia and what it's been experiencing, also because it works largely out of a regular kind of fiscal system, and to do one thing there, it takes 5 steps. Anyway, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all of you. Good evening. I will be quick. I just want to raise a question of cryptocurrencies and taxation. Nowadays, we can make profit selling NFTs. We can sell or buy goods using cryptocurrencies. And some people are even paid partially by Bitcoins or Ethers. I imagine this complexifies taxation. What do you think is the impact of cryptocurrencies on the taxation system, and how to prevent them to create opportunities of tax evasion? Thank you.
Oui, bonsoir, merci pour vos présentations. Il y avait des impôts.
Good evening. There was a wealth taxation system before in Europe. up to the 1980s, people said investors or entrepreneurs don't want to stay here if we have such mechanisms. So do you think if we set up a new instrument, do you think it has to be a multilateral system? What would be the framework? Would it be within with the OECD, or what other framework would it require to be successful? And I will add one question we received from someone who is listening online. I'll do it in English because the question was asked in English.
With the point of view of MMT that a shift of perspective can overcome the difficulties regarding taxation and shift the focus to the possibilities of more active and focused spending of the national state. J'aurais pas été honnête si je n'avais pas retranscrit cette question. Je vous laisse à chacun le soin de choisir les questions auxquelles vous souhaitez répondre.
You can decide what questions you want to pick up on. Up to you. Who's first? Joe?
We actually have in both, at least in the United States and maybe in Europe, a good currency called the dollar and the euro. So I don't think the cryptocurrencies add anything. So my own view is they should be made they should be made illegal. You ask, what do they add? It's crypto. What is crypto about? Secrecy. So the basic principle in my mind is forced disclosure. And when I say forced disclosure, you say you require, just like every American has to, in the tax return every year, have to say whether he has a foreign bank account. You say, do you own any crypto currency? And if you lie and they catch you, you go to jail. So, and I think most people will not lie. There will be some that will lie. And that means inevitable, in order to do most things with cryptocurrencies, you eventually have to turn them into real currencies. And at those points, there are ways that we can monitor when you go into a bank or out of a bank, you can monitor that. So at that point, if the person has not declared that he had a crypto, he would go to jail. So it seems to me that just disclosure requirements would go a long way to actually destroying the cryptocurrencies, because the major advantage they have is secrecy. Let me say on just a remark on MMT. The origins for this idea that the government could spend a lot more without inflationary consequence really has to do with what happened in 2008 during the global financial crisis, where the government expanded the money supply fivefold, both in Europe and the United States, and it did not have inflation. The reason it did not give rise to inflation is the money supply went to the banks effectively, and the banks just held on to it. And so it didn't lead to more spending. So you can create money that just goes into somebody's bank account and it doesn't cause inflation. We're having right now, a big debate in the United States about the role of the pandemic spending in causing the inflation. And if you look at the data, it's very clear it had nothing to do with the inflation. And why not? There were some people who were very, not great economists, who said, oh, if you're going to, government's going to spend that much money, it's going to cause inflation. But if you thought about it for a minute, if it goes into somebody's bank account, the people in the top just saved it. And excess savings went up enormously. So if you look at what actually happened to real consumption, it was actually below trend. So to come back to MMT, if you actually spent money in, for instance, on education, infrastructure, health, that would be inflationary. So if you print money and nothing happens to that money, it's not. But of course, what we're really concerned here is real spending, really addressing our societal problems, helping people at the poor at the bottom have better food, better housing, and that's real resources. And you just can't create real resources out of nothing. Now, right now, in most countries, there is a little bit of excess capacity, but only a very little bit. So we could increase, we could have more expansionary fiscal policies to some, by a few percentage without significant inflationary pressures, probably very, very limited, but not much. So MMT was a theory that worked for a particular moment, and that moment is gone.
If I could just add to that, for developing countries, it could never have worked because, the minute you run a deficit, even if you have excess capacity, you have significant unemployment and all of that, the minute you run a deficit, you get a credit rating downgrade, you get capital flight, your currency depreciates, you get a banking crisis, et cetera, et cetera. This has happened over and over and over again in the developing world. Partly it's because we have these very open and integrated capital accounts, but even if you don't, it can happen in other ways. It can happen with exporters not bringing back their proceeds. It can happen with importers bunching their imports and so on. So yeah, it's not a strategy that can work for the developing world, really. I just want to add another point about cryptocurrency, which is, yes, of course, it's based on secrecy, but I mean, also it's a bubble. You may as well buy a Dutch tulip.
Maybe, Jayati, can you say one word about Tunisia?
I don't know enough about Tunisia, so I regret to say that. The very recent thing.
Yes, I think it's difficult. Gabriel, sur le départ.
Je vais répondre à la question sur.
I can certainly pick up the question on taxation. The question you asked is a very good one. When you look at the arguments that justify the end of taxation for the very rich, the argument was, we can't ask wealthy people to pay taxes because they're going to go to tax havens, they're going to go to Switzerland or places where they pay less taxes. Just so you understand, this is a false argument. It is not true. Tax or letting people flee, that's a choice. But there are other choices, right? Look at what happens in the US. In the US, there are two models. There is the American model. If you're born in the US, if you have American citizenship and your parents move abroad when you're 2 months old and you never go back to the US, you still have to pay taxes in the US for the rest of your life. That's the US model, okay? The French model and the model of all other countries, it's the exact opposite. If you've spent your entire life in France, imagine you became a billionaire in France, you lived there for 70 years. All of a sudden, you decide you're going to move to a low tax country. It's wonderful. On day one, you no longer pay taxes in France. How wonderful. You've spent your entire life, you've earned billions of euros in a country and you no longer pay taxes there. How can this be justified? You've created this huge fortune because of the country, because of the public infrastructures, public goods, public services, education, healthcare system, the French market, French workers, and so on. So it's unimaginable that you will no longer pay a dime, and yet that's what happens. So I think an alternative system is possible. We could find something in between. For example, if you've been a tax resident for a number of years in a given country, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years, and you've become very rich, if you decide to go live abroad, you would still have to pay taxes in your country of origin for a number of years, contingent upon the number of years you lived there. If you've lived for 30 years in a country, you would have to pay taxes in France for, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, or 6 years, I don't know. And this is doable in a very unilateral way. No need for international agreements to do this. It's simply changing the system, the taxation system of non-residents. So unilateral solutions exist for expats. And I will finish there. I think it is better to have cooperative solutions, international agreements. We could very well envisage a system by which we would apply a minimum taxation, a bit like on multinationals. I think that should be the next step. We should apply the same thing to very high net worth individuals. All countries would agree, and all very wealthy people would pay a minimum tax, 1%, 2%, 3%, I don't know. I remember a few years ago when at ICRICT, we talked about the minimum tax rate for multinational companies. We believed in it, but nobody else did. Trust me, nobody did. We were the only ones on the face of the planet. And everybody said, this will never happen. And guess what? Here we are. Very soon, this will become a reality. And I think the same thing will happen when it comes to taxing very high net worth individuals.
Merci.
Thank you so much to all three. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your sometimes painful observations, but there was also some room for optimism. And Jayati, I will keep in mind what you said. It is important to have a strong public voice for greater fiscal justice. Thank you so much. I would like to thank ICRICT, IRIS, the Tax Observatory. Thank you so much for having organized this event with Oxfam. I would like to thank IRIS. Thank you very much for offering this wonderful venue. We will continue our hard work, and we will continue. The subject of today's event was reforming the tax systems to preserve democracy. Very much connected to the values we believe in, values of equality, values of democracy, and we were very happy to hear your three voices. Thank you.